Ava Montgomery was the kind of woman who made headlines without trying, a billionaire heiress whose fortune stretched across industries, tech investments, fashion brands, real estate holdings that spanned New York penthouses to Beverly Hills estates, and though she was admired, envied, and feared in equal measure, her life carried one humiliating irony that gnawed at her more than the whispers of tabloids or the schemes of rival executives. She, a woman who could sign a check to cover the cost of an entire botanical garden, couldn't keep a single plant alive in her own home, and this failure, trivial though it might seem to others, cut into her sense of control like a hidden wound because for Ava, whose whole life had been built around conquering, winning, and displaying perfection, the slow yellowing of leaves in her immaculate marble halls felt like a symbol of something she lacked but could not name. Every orchid shriveled, every fiddle-leaf fig drooped, every succulent crumbled into dust, and even the cactus, mocked by her friends as the easiest plant to keep, had withered under her care, and though she laughed about it at dinner parties, masking her frustration with polished jokes, deep down she hated it, hated that her sprawling Bel Air mansion looked like a sterile museum instead of the lush sanctuary she imagined when she scrolled through the curated gardens of her wealthier peers on social media, hated that when she came home from boardroom battles, instead of breathing in the perfume of blossoms or the freshness of greenery, she stepped into a house that echoed with emptiness and smelled of polished stone and nothingness, and so on one golden California afternoon, after firing yet another high-priced landscaper who had promised foolproof plants, Ava found herself standing in her backyard, heels sinking slightly into the damp grass, arms folded, staring at the man her neighbor had insisted she hire. A gardener who didn't advertise, didn't belong to an agency, and yet carried a reputation whispered with the kind of respect reserved for legends. His name was Elijah Brooks, a man in his late 40s with skin the color of rich mahogany, hair peppered with gray at the temples, and hands weathered from decades of tending earth, hands that looked both calloused and gentle at once. And unlike the uniformed workers Ava was used to, Elijah wore faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a plain white shirt rolled at the sleeves, his quiet presence exuding a kind of gravity that unsettled her because it wasn't the deferential energy she was used to. It was calm, assured, as though he knew something she didn't, and Ava, who had built empires, was not accustomed to being in the presence of anyone who held knowledge she lacked. Still, she spoke first, her voice clipped with impatience, telling him that she had hired the best and seen them fail, that she didn't just want a garden but life, vitality, something real, and that if he thought he was up to the task, he had better deliver, because she wasn't a woman who tolerated excuses. But Elijah only set down his wheelbarrow of soil and tools, wiped his hands on his thighs, and looked at her with eyes that carried neither intimidation nor arrogance, only patience, as he crouched beside a wilted hydrangea near her terrace, pressed his fingers into the soil, and let the earth crumble slowly between them, saying in a low voice that carried more weight than a shout, "Plants don't die just because of water or sunlight, Miss Montgomery, they die because no one listens to them." And Ava blinked, laughed sharply, saying, "Listens? To plants?" "Elijah, I run a company worth $2 billion, I negotiate with predators in boardrooms, I don't have time to sit around and listen to leaves." But Elijah did not flinch, did not shift under her laugh the way most people did. Instead he studied the limp hydrangea with reverence and said, "And yet here you are, desperate to keep them alive." And for a moment Ava faltered. Her retort caught in her throat because she realized it was true, realized that despite her wealth and schedule, she cared, she wanted life in her home, not just decorations. And Elijah continued, speaking slowly, deliberately, as though sharing something sacred, "You've been treating plants like ornaments, Miss Montgomery. Things to fill your space. But they're not ornaments, they're living. The trick is simple, give them attention, not expectation. Don't water them by the clock, don't put them in a corner and expect them to perform. Touch the soil. Notice the leaves. They'll tell you what they need if you're patient enough to hear it. My grandmother taught me that back in Georgia. She said plants are like people, ignored too long, they wither. Listened to, they thrive." And though Ava wanted to roll her eyes, something in his voice stopped her, something that felt like truth, and as she watched his rough hands handle the fragile hydrangea with such gentleness, she felt a twinge of humility, rare for her, as if perhaps her endless failures weren't about bad luck or bad staff, but about her own inability to slow down, to pay attention, to connect. And so began a reluctant partnership in which Ava, initially out of pride and stubbornness, started to linger during Elijah's work hours, telling herself she was supervising, but slowly finding herself kneeling beside him, learning, listening, watching as he showed her how to check moisture with fingertips, how to track sunlight through the arc of the day, how to repot without shocking the roots, how to mist leaves and feed soil with compost instead of relying on chemical shine. And Ava, who had never dirted her hands outside of a luxury spa, found herself sinking them into soil, feeling life pulse through the earth, and for the first time, her plants lived, not just lived but thrived, and something within her shifted. Her marble mansion slowly transformed as Elijah's guidance and her growing attention coaxed green back into it. Orchids blossomed in her kitchen, lavender filled the air near her terrace, vines climbed along the balcony railings, and a fiddle-leaf fig in her study stretched taller with each passing week. And Ava found herself breathing differently in her own home, slower, fuller, as though for the first time she wasn't surrounded by emptiness but by presence. And one evening, as the sun burned the sky orange and gold, Ava stood beside Elijah by a bed of roses he had restored, watching the petals catch the light like fire, and whispered almost to herself, "I don't understand it. I've had millions, Elijah. Millions. But this feels richer than anything I've ever owned." And Elijah gave her the faintest smile, that quiet, knowing smile that always unsettled her, and replied, "That's because you don't own it. You're part of it." And in that moment, Ava felt the truth settle in her bones, that the reason she had failed for so long wasn't because she lacked skill or tools or the right staff, but because she had treated life itself as something to control, to display, to bend to her will, instead of something to witness, to nurture, to join. And though she didn't yet say it aloud, she knew deep down that Elijah hadn't just shown her how to keep a plant alive. He had unlocked a hidden trick to keeping her own heart alive, too. And as she looked at him, his hands resting in the soil, his eyes reflecting a wisdom that came not from books or boardrooms but from generations of listening to the earth, Ava Montgomery, the billionaire who could buy anything, realized she had finally found something priceless she could not purchase but only earn: presence.